We're very excited to have David Adler from the Adler Law Firm joining us. My name is Risa Eldon. I'm here on behalf of Ivy, which is a business and community management tool for designers. We help you streamline your overall workflow from end to end, creating proposals and tear sheets, purchase orders. We've also built a flourishing community of designers. So if you want to leverage any sort of help from your design peers, Ivy is the way to go. And I want to give a little bit of background about David before we get started. We've worked with David previously. He is a wealth of knowledge. And over the last 22 years, David has provided legal assistance to home professionals with business, intellectual property, media, entertainment, and technology needs. Peer designated as an Illinois leading lawyer since 2016. And Illinois super lawyer for the 9th consecutive year. He is also a member of the Illinois State Bar Association, Privacy and Information Security Council, and former adjunct professor at DePaul College of Law. What does this all mean? David has specifically created his firm to help home professionals gain a competitive advantage by enabling them to identify, protect, and leverage their ideas and creative work. The firm provides cohesive counsel across these interconnected matters of general business and contract needs, contracts, we've talked about that before, it's a big one, intellectual property, and technology-related matters. Adler's Law, their mission is to help clients maximize commercial potential while minimizing legal risks and costs. So we know that today's session is about choosing the right legal entity for your business, whether you've just started your business or you've been in business for 10 years. And I'm super thrilled that David is kind of going to go over all of the ins and outs for us and give us a clear breakdown on action steps that you need to take to really take your business to that next level and make sure that you're covered legally. So without further ado, I'm going to let you take over, David, and tell us everything from the basics to the structure of legal entities, and we'll definitely be sure to answer your questions at the end of our session.
Great. Thank you very much, Risa. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to attend the webinar. Thanks to Ivy for making this possible and giving us a platform. It's really important to me, and I certainly enjoy sharing my knowledge to the creative community. I think Risa did a great job kind of giving background of me and my firm. I'll give you just a very quick kind of introduction to how I got to where I am today. Early on in my career, I worked for a very large firm doing mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, a lot of contract work. I really enjoyed the corporate world. But I was looking for a better platform for me to allow me to reach entrepreneurs. And so in the late 90s, I started my own practice. And ever since then, I've really focused on the needs of creative professionals across many industries and helping them with the business legal needs. And so today's topic, choosing the right legal entity for your business, this is a cornerstone of my practice. It's a cornerstone of every business. And hopefully, we'll come out today with some better knowledge and better understanding of what all of this means. Very quickly, this is sort of the agenda that I have set for this webinar. I need to get some housekeeping disclaimers out of the way before we jump into the meat of the content. I want to make sure that the listeners, the viewers out there come away with a good understanding of the pros and cons of each legal entity. We're going to talk about several different types of legal entities today. Each one has pluses and minuses. So hopefully you'll have a better understanding of what those are and how they affect your business. Once I give you sort of the 35,000 foot overview of the different types of business entities, I'll go through a more detailed discussion of reasons why you might select one entity as opposed to another, and maybe some of the operational issues that come into play, as well as financial planning issues and other things to think about. And then lastly, as Risa said, we will save some time at the end for questions. I recommend saving questions to the end. The way I've planned this out is we should start from a sort of a very general discussion of the subject, kind of work our way down to more specific questions and issues. And then I suspect at the end, many of you will share the same questions. And so if we keep those questions to the end, we'll really be able to get the best bang for the buck in terms of being able to try and address everybody's questions. So with that, let's dive right into choosing a legal entity. This is a question, that a lot of my clients come to me with. I've worked with many first-time entrepreneurs over the years, and I've worked with other seasoned and serial entrepreneurs. And just knowing where to start is a constant question that I get. So one of the first questions, and I had a lengthy discussion with a client yesterday, why choose a legal business entity? Why should I do that as opposed to doing something else? The principal reason that somebody would choose a business entity is to have some sort of limited liability. The business entity structure, by definition, limits liability to the owners for the debts of the business. What does this mean in real life? Well, let's say, for example, your business gets sued, okay? Let's say, for example, the lawsuit is, in the favor of the plaintiff and a judgment is entered against the business. Having a business entity would protect your personal assets, your home, your car, your savings, from any liability in those types of circumstances. Now, that's sort of the textbook case, and there's other forms of liability, and other risks associated with a business. The idea being that the business entity shields the owner or owners from personal liability. And I think it's a really important consideration. Regardless of your, wealth status today, presuming you are all successful over the years, you will have more and more to protect, and that risk will grow. So having a business entity from the get-go is it's a necessity. Sort of one of the intangible benefits that a business entity gives you is it kind of makes you look a little bit more official. It makes you look like a real business, as unfortunate as that is to say. I mean, I don't mean that somebody who's a sole proprietor or partnership is any less of a business, but in the business world, you hear the, Inc., Limited, LLC. It sort of, it elevates the stature of the business in the minds of business people, I think. Another sort of intangible benefit to having a business entity, it gives you some name protection. By having your business incorporated or organized on the books of a particular state, your business name is now part of the public record, and you do help, it helps establish and to a limited extent, protect some of your common law rights in the business name. And from my experience and what I see today, the growth of the internet, the growth of social media marketing, the growth of online advertising, it's a global marketplace. So brands and company names are always at risk, and having that business entity helps at least plant the flag as to who this business is and what their name is. The second question I often get is, okay, I'm in, how much? It really sort of depends. Typical lawyer answer. For the most part, it's relatively inexpensive. Expect to pay attorney's fees for consultation and documentation related to the entity. Expect to pay filing fees. Filing fees vary from state. They could be less than $100 to several $100s. It's unlikely filing fees would be more than a few $100s. Sometimes states break up the fees based on just regular filing fees, expedited filing, and so forth. I know the state of Delaware has a very complicated and graduated plan, and you can have rush service that is turned around in the same hour. Most businesses probably don't need that, but that's something to keep in mind. I would say expect to budget anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 on attorney's fees for your typical business setup. And by that, I mean the things that we'll talk about today: creating the business entity, making sure all the proper forms are in place, doing all the business registrations, and that sort of thing. So typically, those are what you're looking at in terms of costs. The next question I get is, well, how hard is it? Is this something I can do myself, or do I really need to go to a lawyer? For some things, if you're a seasoned business professional and you've been down the path before, I would say it's probably not too difficult for you to file articles of incorporation or articles of organization on your own. From my perspective, I think that is sort of one of the just first steps in a longer process of getting a business up and running and getting it set up properly. And so my recommendation would always be to seek the advice of a seasoned professional, just to make sure that you're not missing tasks that you just didn't know about. But typically, in terms of having a professional form your business for you, usually you can do it in 24 hours, at least. The formation of the legal entity, obtaining an EIN, and getting all set up and ready to go and open bank accounts and hit the ground running. And business entities are formed for any number of reasons. You might choose a business entity because of a particular business transaction, such as an investment or something like that. Those are a little bit outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but you could see that's another scenario when you might need to form a business entity relatively quickly. So obviously it's not terribly time consuming to set one up, but depending on whether it's a corporation, LLC, LLP, or one of the other entities we'll talk about today, there are additional tasks that might be required. And so getting to that last point, how long does it take? As I said, usually you can get the business entity formed within 24 hours. That's pretty standard across all 50 states. The other documentation, state business registration, preparing the corporate record book, things like that, those usually take a little bit more time. If you had to have the whole soup to nuts done in one day, you probably could get it done. But I would say typically, it takes a few weeks to get all the T's crossed, I's dotted, and paperwork in order. So that's a little bit about the background of setting up a business entity. Let's roll up our sleeves and actually talk about the different types of business entities. So this slide is by no means an exhaustive list of every type of business entity out there, but it really covers sort of the 5 major kinds that you're going to encounter or that you are going to consider in your business. The first type is a sole proprietor. From there, we graduate to partnership, LLC, LLP, hybrid, and for some reason, corporation is not on that list, but a corporation should be on there. So we'll talk about sole proprietor first. A sole proprietor is just an individual doing business. Think of the lemonade stand on the sidewalk. Okay, that's a sole proprietor. You're selling a product. You're receiving income for that product. There's no additional legal requirement to establish your sole proprietorship. Some people would choose to maybe adopt an assumed name. And there's a difference between doing business as adopted assumed name and a corporate adopted name. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But a sole proprietor is just an individual doing business. There's no specific legal requirements. You would simply list your lemonade stand on your taxes, or in your case, if you're an interior designer and you just want to start out of your home part-time, maybe on the weekends or something, you get yourself a website, an email address, and boom, you're in business. That's a sole proprietor. The downside, of course, the sole proprietor is that there's no shield to risk. There's no limited liability. There's no business structure there protecting the sole proprietor. And I'll get into that a little bit later. The second type of sort of simple business entity is the partnership. A partnership is any time you have 2 or more people or businesses in business together. In the classic partnership, all the partners share equally, or pro rata. So if you have 2 partners, they share 50-50. 3 partners, it's a third, a third, a third. 4 partners, it's a fourth, a fourth, a fourth. You get the idea. The benefits of partnership, like sole proprietor, is that it's very easy to set up. You simply decide that you and your partner or partners are going to hold yourselves out for business. You're going to buy raw materials, manufacture widgets, sell services, what have you. You're in business. One of the downsides to the partnership is, again, it's not a limited liability type of entity. So all of the partners are unlimitedly liable for any of the debts or obligations of the business. The added sort of complication in a partnership is that partners may also be obligated to each other, so that if one partner causes a liability, the other partner is just as liable for that as the partner who caused it. So while simple to set up, partnerships don't really provide a lot of liability protection. They can be used for certain circumstances, and they certainly do have benefits in terms of allowing flexibility of operation. The third type of business entity I'm going to talk about is corporation, which I apologize was left off of this this bulleted list here. The corporation is probably the most common type of business entity. Most people have heard of a corporation, an Inc., a corp, a limited company. Those names are usually not unfamiliar. The difference between a corporation and the other business types we talked about is that a corporation is a fictitious legal entity. So a corporation requires that you go to the Secretary of State of a particular state, or in some international situations, maybe, depending on how the particular country is set up, you go to the province or you go to the governing authority and you apply to have your business entity created. In the case of corporations, it's called incorporating a corporation. A corporation has some interesting characteristics. As a legal business entity, it can sue and be sued. It can enter into contracts. It can do everything a human being can do. It has legal rights and legal obligations. Corporations are sort of, what's the best word? They are formal business entities. There's a lot of rules and structure around how a corporation has to be set up. Typically, it is, one share of ownership equals one vote on decisions. So if let's say we think of a corporation that has two shareholders, each shareholder is 50-50 owner, each shareholder would have either one equal vote, or let's say each shareholder held 100 shares of the company, so that there were a total of 200 shares. If it's one share, one vote, each shareholder gets 100 votes on a decision. And the decisions might be, do we buy a large asset? Do we enter into a government contract? Do we sell all of our inventory? Do we bring on a new owner, right? What would that look like? So those types of decisions in the operation and management of the business are conducted by shareholders by vote, and it is typically one share, one vote. Corporations are also typified by their fairly arcane and formulaic governance structure. So in a corporation, you have basically three roles. You have the shareholder, you have the director, and you have the officer. In a corporation, the shareholders are the owners. The shareholders elect the directors, who then make decisions about management of the business. And typically the board of directors will appoint officers to run the day-to-day operations. So this is why you have things like CEO, COO, CTO, president, secretary, treasurer. These are all corporate titles that have real legal authority inside the corporate entity. And these decisions are usually flow down from the board of directors. So the shareholders, the owners, control who's on the board of directors, and then the board of directors controls how the business is run. In most small businesses, where you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 shareholders, you may not have that really formal structure. There are what are known as close corporations. Close corporations are generally managed by the shareholders directly, without using a board and without having separate officers. So it's just in a smaller, closely held company, you can, do away with some of that formality. Corporations have, federal and state, oftentimes, not all states, but often have state and federal filing requirements, periodic filing requirements. I'm not really going to get into tax considerations because it's kind of outside the scope of this, but I will talk about sort of the different tax implications to owners as it relates to different types of business entities. So with corporations, they're generally, the corporation and the owners are taxed on the profits of the business, okay? So with a corporation, it's important to understand that a corporation is a corporation is a corporation, okay? People are often confused when they hear the terms C corporation and S corporation. C corporation and S corporation are two different tax classification statuses for federal and state tax purposes. And what this means is, if your corporation is a C corporation, then it is taxed at the entity level, the corporation pays taxes, and at the owner level, the shareholders pay taxes. Some companies must be C corporations due to the ownership restrictions on S corporations. So S corporations are limited in terms of who can be an owner, how many owners you can have, and some other structures related to ownership. Typically, most small businesses will elect to be an S corporation. What does that mean? Unlike a C corporation, an S corporation is treated as a pass-through entity. So this means that the entity itself does not pay taxes. The owners of the entity pay taxes based on their pro rata share of the income or the loss. So again, two shareholder corporation, they equally own it. Each shareholder reports in 50% of the income and pays taxes on that directly. So again, a corporation is a type of business structure. A C corporation or an S corporation is simply the way it is taxed. It does not really affect ownership structure unless you're getting into an entity that has a very large number of owners. So publicly traded companies can't be S corporations, for example. Okay. Corporations are typified by sort of a rigid and formalistic structure. You have to have annual meetings. You typically have to follow that pattern of shareholder electing board choosing officers conducting day-to-day business. Managing those corporate records is a requirement of the continuing operation of the legal entity. It's just good business practice, but in the case of a corporation, it is required that the corporation maintain certain records in order to maintain its corporate status. Legal business entities have annual filing requirements, so they pay what are known as franchise taxes. And again, this is sort of a legal term of art that it's a different type of tax and is not really the same thing as like an income tax. A franchise tax is really more like a license fee that a business entity pays to the state for the privilege of doing business. And whether you are incorporated in the state or whether you are an out-of-state business doing business in a particular state, you may need to pay franchise taxes in that state. And every state is different as to how they make that calculation as to when those taxes are due. So look to your particular state. Obviously, when you work with somebody to set up your business entity, part of that discussion will be ongoing maintenance of the entity. But unlike sole proprietorships or partnerships, corporation is a formal legal entity. It has formal ongoing legal requirements. And a corporation can also be dissolved. I mean, you can terminate that entity status as well. The second, or let's say the third type now, fourth type of legal entity is an LLC. So an LLC is the new kid on the block. The LLC is the limited liability company. And LLCs are interesting. LLCs were more or less created to take the best features of partnerships and combine them with the best features of corporations, that being limited liability. What's unique about an LLC is that it doesn't have to follow the same formal and rigid structure that a corporation has to follow in terms of management and decision making. More importantly, In an LLC, you can separate ownership from voting control from participation in profit and loss. So it makes the entity very, very, very flexible for a lot of planning needs and transactional needs and complex business structures. Does a single owner business entity need to be an LLC? Maybe not. But there's something to be said for the simplicity and the lack of formal requirements in order to maintain the LLC over time. Like the corporation, an LLC is formed by the state, so you file articles of organization as opposed to articles of incorporation. An LLC has owners, called members. An LLC may choose to have managers, and in order to sort of differentiate LLC terms from corporation terms, most lawyers use the sort of a different nomenclature. So with corporations, you have shareholders and directors. With LLCs, you have members and managers, and the manager sort of fills that role of director. In other words, being chosen by the members to manage the business affairs and maybe appoint officers and do other things. With a single person business entity, setting up a corporation, setting up an LLC are relatively similar and simple. The amount of paperwork is generally similar. When you get multiple owners, okay, it tends to complicate things because now for both corporations and LLCs, you have to start thinking about how are you going to structure management of the business in terms of who gets to vote on what, right? You need to think about how do you structure ownership? Does somebody, own more of the business than somebody else? What are the parties bringing to the table? You need to think about what happens if we want to bring on a new owner. You need to think about what happens if an owner wants to leave, get bought out. And then you have to think about other factors that might affect ownership and control as well. So part of the planning for LLCs and corporations is thinking about how that ownership structure is going to look over time and making sure that the proper mechanics are in there to handle typical business life events, such as, adding or removing owners and that sort of thing. The key difference between an LLC and a corporation is that an LLC is governed by a contract known as the operating agreement. Now, you don't have to have an operating agreement. You can choose to be governed by your state's default LLC rules. Those will be in the statute. So there's a corporation statute, there's an LLC statute. These are the statutes that govern the rights and obligations of these legal entities. You can always choose to just follow your state's default rules, or you can choose to have an operating agreement drafted that would address the issues of management and ownership and the other things that go along with owning a business entity. And typically most business lawyers will be able to walk you through the ins and outs of that whole process. The reason that the LLC is, I think, the more favored business entity these days is precisely that ability to separate ownership and control. So for example, let's say you have two entrepreneurs who are starting a new business. One entrepreneur is bringing skills and experience but doesn't have any cash. The other entrepreneur is bringing cash that's needed to start the business, do the marketing, service the customers, that sort of thing. The two parties agree that each one is bringing something to the table, and each side is sort of equally going to reap the benefits of this. In the corporate structure, each person would be a 50-50 owner, and each person would get 50-50 of the profit or loss. And each person would have 50-50 vote on decisions of the business. In an LLC, you don't have to be 50-50. And in the corporation, you could be 60-40, 70-30, but the voting control and the profit split would be that same proportion, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30. In an LLC, you can say, we are 50-50 owners. We are 50-50 decision makers. But in recognition of the fact that the money person brought the cash, that person should have a preferred treatment in terms of how the income is allocated. So you could have an LLC where you have 50-50 owners, but maybe one of the owners gets 80% of the income for a certain period or for the life of the business, and the other person gets 20% of the income. They still equal owners, but you have that split. Now, that's getting into probably more sophisticated business planning than most designers are going to think about. However, I want you to understand that that's sort of the reason behind choosing an LLC. There's just tremendous flexibility in terms of planning and structure, and working with an attorney who really knows how to do that is the best way to kind of take advantage of that. Again, kind of just recapping a couple of things. The LLC, like the corporation, provides limited liability for its owners. So if you're a member of an LLC, you are not personally liable for the debts and obligations of that business. The business shields your personal assets from that type of liability. The LLC, like the corporation, is a fictitious business entity. You have to register with the state and file other, legal formalities in order to establish it and maintain it. There's different terms of art out there for starting up a new business entity. And most attorneys will say you incorporate a corporation, you form or organize an LLC, and you don't really use the term register a business. So in my world, registering a business really means like filling out some kind of form to kind of get that business on the books of, a particular, maybe it's a regulator or maybe it's another sort of governmental entity. But registration to me doesn't necessarily confer forming a new business. And that's important because different states use these terms differently. So I've seen a lot of information out there on the internet that kind of uses the terms interchangeably and somewhat confusingly, I might add. So just, kind of be aware of the terminology with those types of businesses. Sort of the last type of, or the second to last, I guess, type of business entity I'll talk about very quickly is the limited liability partnership, an LLP. This is a cross between something like a corporation LLC and a partnership. In an LLP, you have a general partner that is unlimitedly liable for the debts of the business, much the way a traditional partnership works. And then you have limited partners whose ownership and control and limitation of liability is contractually determined under the LLP agreement. So again, it's a more formalistic business entity. It's a business entity that does require registration as opposed to just simply forming it by the will of the parties. It has ongoing obligations. Typically, you see LLPs in the context of real estate development. It's really sort of a purpose-driven type of entity. You can use corporations for real estate development. You can use LLCs for real estate development. But before they were LLCs, they were LLPs. So I think that one still hangs around. And again, it's a more sophisticated business entity. Typically, most design businesses or home-based businesses are not going to be looking for an LLP. Just, in the interest of covering all the bases, there's other types of entities within these. Some states have sort of low-profit corporations, or they also have not-for-profit corporations. Those are kind of outside the scope of our discussion today, so I'm not really going to spend any time on them. LLCs, in addition to being unique on their own, also have an advantage in terms of creating nesting or subsidiary type businesses. There are what are known as series LLCs, which look like sort of a parent-child type relationship where you might have a parent LLC and have several series LLCs underneath it. I have most often seen those in the context of real estate development, where you have a pool of money that then owns, let's say, 3 different properties. So the pool of money is held in the parent LLC. Each individual property is a series LLC for purposes of limiting that liability. The liability of every series is siloed so that liability from one asset doesn't transfer to the other. Lastly, there are hybrid entities. So you could have, some combination of LLC corporation, usually in terms of corporate structure. Again, I mentioned, you have these low profit corporations. An LLP is also itself a kind of a hybrid, because there is usually a general partner that's a business entity separate and apart from the other owners. So just to kind of recap, I know this is a lot of information. Some of it may have made sense, some may have not. The key to remember is that for your business, you're really thinking about how can I limit my liability? What is available to me to limit my liability? And in the grand scheme of things, it probably boils down to the choice of either a corporation or an LLC, because that is going to give you the unlimited liability, or I'm sorry, the limited liability for your personal assets. Both entities offer advantages in terms of tax treatment, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the key is that those are really going to be your choices. And what I encourage you to do is talk to your lawyer, talk to your accountant, get a sense of why that professional recommends particular business structure for your business. So those are the different types. And what I'd like to do now is get into just a more specific discussion of the pros and cons of each entity, so you can compare and contrast them a little bit further. And I know I've sort of addressed these with broad brushstrokes, but this is a more specific breakdown of kind of what I go through in my mind when I'm trying to think about, well, what's the best business entity for the situation? So again, starting at the beginning, sole proprietor. This one's cheap and easy. There's no paperwork necessary. You hit the ground running, right? It's a very easy one to start. It's a very easy one to finish, easy to walk away from at the end of the day. The downside, unlimited liability, right? You are the business. You are liable for all the debts of the business. Anything, it could be satisfied by resorting to your personal assets, car, home, savings, what have you. One step up from the sole proprietor is the partnership. Again, like the sole proprietor, it's pretty cheap and easy. There's really no paperwork requirement, although you're encouraged to have some kind of a partnership agreement that talks about, well, what happens if we need to walk away from this, and how do we share responsibilities and stuff like that. But it's not required. And certainly it's less paperwork than forming a more formal business entity like a corporation or an LLC. Again, major drawback to partnership, unlimited liability of all the partners. So, that's something to think about. And again, like I mentioned before, when you have multiple partners, you now have multiple vectors of liability, because every member of the partnership is the authorized agent of the partnership and the other partners. So it's important to consider, how that risk is spread. The third type of entity we talked about, the corporation, is usually the best choice for most businesses. First of all, it offers limited liability, right? The owners do not have liability for the debts and obligations of business. Another benefit of a corporation is that it allows the owners to control certain assets. If you need to, it's not something we talked about earlier, but sometimes a business entity can be formed for the purpose of holding certain assets. And by putting it in a corporate structure, you might be able to affect how those assets are controlled, so that by apportioning ownership to different stakeholders and affecting how that governance is structured, you can control those assets through a more formalistic process. Another benefit of corporations that I didn't talk about before is the fact that corporations offer different types of ownership. So you may be familiar with the term common shares of stock, or Class A shares, Class B shares, preferred shares. Ownership can be structured with different rights and remedies. And so typically these are called, in a corporation, different classes of stock. And you might have common stock that has, one share, one vote, voting rights, and has, the right to receive a pro rata share of profits or losses. Corporation also allows you to create preferred shares, or shares of stock that are other than the common. So you might have a share of stock that has a liquidation preference. So, for example, if a corporation is dissolved, then preferred share owners would be paid first before the common share owners. That's typically how it works. You might have voting control that is amplified in a particular share of stock. So corporations, depending on how they're structured, can have different types of ownership, and that allows businesses to accommodate different types of stakeholders. Again, thinking back to the entrepreneur who brings the skills and experience and the entrepreneur who brings the cash. So each party brings something different to the table. Corporations allow you to structure ownership in a way that will accommodate for some other types of differences. The downsides to things like corporation, number one, they're expensive, right? You're going to probably have to hire a lawyer to set it up properly and prepare all the documents. You're going to have to pay filing fees to the Secretary of State to get the entity registered or formed in that state. Corporations are formalistic. It usually, to do certain types of corporate action, you have to file paperwork with the state. That also may incur filing fees as well. So you have those costs, and then corporations are complex. Ownership structure is complex. Managing the operations, following what are known as corporate formalities and the operation of the business requires a certain amount of knowledge and does require that you jump through certain hoops. So maintaining the corporation does require a certain level of ongoing effort. Similarly, the LLC offers limited liability to the owners. This is the principal reason we form business entities. LLCs also give owners the ability to control the assets. Like I talked about the real estate example before, owning different businesses or owning different buildings as different assets within a business structure. LLCs offer the additional benefit of flexibility, the ability to structure ownership and control and management of an entity using a contract as opposed to using the more archaic and rigid corporate forms allows the LLC to work more fluidly, and it allows it to adapt to changing business situations over time with a little greater ease. LLCs have been around for at least 20 years now, maybe longer. They're starting to become a little bit more accepted as business entities, but they're still seen as sort of the new kid on the block. So not everybody's always comfortable with them, and there's still some misinformation and myths surrounding them. So, you may not see everybody jumping on the bandwagon of LLCs. Like corporations, LLCs have different kinds of ownership. You can have common ownership where everybody owns the same thing. You can have preferred ownership where, let's say, a Series A preferred owner has, a liquidation preference, a distribution preference, meaning they get paid before other people. They may have a voting preference. You may have one vote, they may have two. So all of these things can be done with different types of ownership in the LLC. Downsides to the LLC, well, like the corporation, it's expensive. It's going to cost money and attorney's fees to set it up. It's going to definitely cost attorney's fees to draft an operating agreement that is comprehensive and really has the type of flexibility that a business needs to take advantage of what the structure offers. Again, it does follow formalities. You have to file with the state to organize an LLC. You have to maintain annual filings. You have to do business registrations. So all of those formalities also apply to LLCs. Lastly, LLP, again, limited liability, offers that ability to control assets, offers that flexibility in operation and management, but again, is an expensive business entity to form and maintain, and also follows formal requirements. Let me make sure I'm kind of on the right track here. Okay, so now I've kind of talked about the pros and cons of the different entities. I'm going to drill down a little bit to some of the more particular issues that you will see in these business entities. Now, the purpose of today's webinar is not to talk through all the different ways that these things can play out, but these are business issues that must be considered when you're forming these entities. if you're thinking about a partnership, voting control is one of the first things, and you'll see throughout this that voting control is one of the key concerns of any business. Also having proper buy-sell provisions, because a partnership sort of exists or doesn't exist at the leisure of its partners. The only way to sort of reduce the risk to the extent one can is to have some sort of a partnership agreement that addresses issues of buy-sell and being able to, leave the partnership. So I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on partnerships. Corporations. Corporations require formal action for just about everything they do. There's usually some kind of form that needs to be filed with the Secretary of State in order for a corporation to take certain action. Anytime that you have multiple owners of the corporation, you need to talk about how ownership is going to be structured, whether all shareholders or stockholders are to be treated the same, or whether you have different kinds of shareholders and what that might mean. Part of the conversation needs to be around management. Will there be directors? Who will elect the directors? How many directors are you going to have? What is the minimum vote required for director action? For example, let's say that you have a business with 10 shareholders. Let's say the business has 5 directors. So each of the shareholders gets to vote on who the 5 directors are. The 5 directors are charged with making business decisions for the management of the business. And so the shareholders say, hey, listen, company A over here wants to buy us out. We are telling you, directors, to negotiate the purchase of the business. Do the directors have to vote unanimously in favor? Do they have to vote unanimously against? How many directors need to vote in favor? And this is where working with a lawyer helps, because understanding the dynamics of voting control and the number of board seats and the number of shareholders is important, so that when tough decisions arise in the business in the future, you know what the mechanics are going to look like. You know that in this case, maybe 3 of the 5 directors all have to vote together in order for action to pass, right? So it's important to understand that there's that level of complexity going in and thinking about it at the formation stage. Other things to think about with a corporation is that ownership is not freely transferable. I can't just pick up the phone, call my friend Bill and say, hey, Bill, I'd like you to buy half of my company for, $100, right? Shares in corporations are not freely transferable. They are subject to statutory restrictions on transfer. They are subject to state and federal securities laws restrictions on transfer. And they may be subject to restrictions on transfer in the organizational documents of the entity, as well as things like shareholder agreements or contracts amongst the owners. So again, something to think about when you have multiple owner entities is how, what are the rights and obligations and responsibilities that affect that ownership? Just like the corporation, an LLC shares many of those features. As I talked about earlier, the LLC is highly flexible. So there are many, many ways that ownership and control and management can be structured in that operating agreement. And it allows for very, very complex structures. Although admittedly, most of the people watching this webinar today are not going to need very, very complex structures. The flip side of that coin for an LLC is that LLCs do not follow a lot of rigid requirements or formalistic requirements. So generally speaking, once an LLC is formed, you're done. You do not have to do continuous paperwork, except for the annual report needs to be filed. But just the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day decision-making, the day-to-day paperwork for the legal entity itself is much less with an LLC. And for a lot of my clients, it's sort of that paperwork burden that is the deciding factor between a corporation and LLC. Corporation equals more paperwork. LLC generally equals less paperwork. One big difference that we haven't really talked about yet today is sort of the tax consequences of corporations and LLCs. As I mentioned, a corporation can be taxed either as a C corporation or an S corporation. A C corporation is double taxed, corporation and owners. S corporation is a pass-through entity, only owners are taxed. LLC is a pass-through entity. It is only the owners are taxed. The entity itself does not pay taxes. Now, the principal difference for tax purposes between a corporation and LLC is that an LLC is treated as a disregarded entity. And what that means is all of the profit or loss flows directly through to the owner, almost as though the owner were a sole proprietor. In a corporation, not all of the income of a business necessarily is taxed the same way. And this taxation issue is a conversation for another time. Most of my accountant friends will tell you that a corporation can pay a dividend on which certain taxes are not required. And wages and other income does require the payment of those taxes. So in a corporation and an S corporation, you might have income that can be taken out of the entity at a slightly lower tax burden, okay? To simplify it, it's maybe a little cheaper to get money out of a corporation than an LLC. However, it's not a huge difference, right? In an LLC, there's no way to declare a dividend and not pay some of the federal withholding. You have to pay it regardless. So for that reason, there's a slight difference in tax treatment. If you're really concerned about it and it's really affecting your ability to choose between two entities, feel free to ask your accountant what that person suggests, because they're probably in the best position to advise you on that issue. From my perspective as a lawyer, I'm going to tell you 9 times out of 10, the LLC is probably the best choice for a single owner or small business entity. That's just due to the lack of formality, the lack of long-term costs, the flexibility in operation, some of those intangible benefits that you get. Corporations are just complicated and formalistic, and you have to fill out a lot of paperwork to keep them going. Generally speaking, they can be less expensive to own and less expensive to maintain, but you have to balance those factors out. Lastly, again, LLP, highly flexible ownership structure. Pretty much anything I said about the corporation and the LLC would apply to the LLP. For those of you who have partners or who are thinking of having business partners, LLCs and corporations do have mechanisms for governance and control. And it's important to sort of understand how those play out within those business structures. So that should be part of your decision making and part of your discussions as you choose these entities. I know I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm just going to sort of summarize at the very end with a couple of points. We're talking about choosing the business structure or the legal structure that really best fits your particular needs. Things to think about are, how many owners are there? If it's just one, it's really going to make it a no-brainer. Does your business need limited liability? I would say any business needs limited liability. So it shouldn't even be a question as to whether you want to form a business entity. It should only be a question as to which one. Do you need to worry about controlling assets? Will there be different types of owners, and will there be different types of assets within the business? Hard assets versus soft assets, things like widgets, machinery versus intellectual property, copyright, trademark, content. Tax treatment, tax considerations, the ability to transfer ownership and the tax consequences of that should go into the analysis. And then lastly, state requirements. Some states don't require state income tax. So, there might be a benefit to forming your business in that state. Some states have more formal requirements than others in terms of just forming the business at the beginning. I know certain states require just additional documentation and additional filings, and there are sometimes additional steps. So make sure that you talk to your lawyer about any additional steps that might be required in your particular state. With that, I would like to open it up to questions for whatever time we have remaining.
Great. Thank you so much, David. That was a lot of information, but very important information that we need, the design community, home professionals need to know when not only just getting their business started, because I know a lot of designers and home professionals that have started their businesses and just hit the ground running with the sole proprietorship and then never looked back and never thought about the liability and that they need to make a change. So I think that this is really good to keep in mind, and it can happen at any point in your business. Obviously, it's probably best if you think about it in the beginning, but you shouldn't feel like you did something wrong or that you can't make a change even if you've been in business for a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. You can incorporate or organize an LLC at any time. There's no reason not to.
Great. So let's get to some of our questions. It sounded like there was a couple questions about this. What should I keep? And we might have covered this, but I just want to make sure that we answer everybody's questions. And if we did cover it, David, maybe you can sum it up for us. Sure. What should I keep in mind in deciding whether to become an LLC versus sole prop as a single member small business owner?
That's an excellent question. And I think the key to that is understanding that as a sole proprietor, you have unlimited liability. Anything that you own is at risk. Your car, your house, your apartment, your furniture, your paycheck, whatever it is. If you're a sole proprietor, anything you own is at risk. With an LLC, all of your personal assets are shielded from any risk from the business. Now, you get into a car and you drive drunk and you kill somebody, your LLC is not going to protect you, okay? But if you're in your business, if you have a bad client and you get sued, or if something goes south, or if there's an injury to somebody, your business entity will protect you against personal liability for those kinds of risks. And I know many designers who've managed to go without a business entity for years and have never had a problem. And to them, I can only say, bless you, you're very, very lucky. But you're always taking that risk.
Yeah. I think that's a good answer to the question. And it kind of floats around the lines of like, do you want to take the risk or do you want to have that peace of mind?
Right. And, I'll put it in perspective for you. I do have a designer client who's in New York, who's literally raising her life from financial ruin that was not her fault. It was perpetrated on her by somebody else. She doesn't own a home. She doesn't own a car. She lives basically paycheck to paycheck, right? And we had this very discussion. She's like, if somebody sues me, they need to get in line behind all of these other people that I'm trying to, resolve issues with. And again, the designer was not at fault. Somebody defrauded her and ruined her finances. And, she was like, do I need a corporation? I said, well, frankly, if there's no assets to protect, then maybe not. But I would suspect that most of you out there probably have some assets that you want to protect and are not in that very, very dire circumstance.
That makes sense. And then we had a question about what specific type of lawyer or accountant should I consult with to determine a structure for my business?
Oh, you know what? I think you cut out on the last part of that.
Oh, yeah. Let me repeat. What specific type of lawyer or accountant should I consult with to determine a structure for my business?
I think that most business lawyers, most lawyers who say that they are corporate lawyers or business lawyers and have been in business for a few years and are familiar with corporations and LLCs, can guide you through all of that necessary decision making. I would say for most design businesses, it helps to have an accountant who's familiar with your industry. First of all, I think there's real value to that. But most small business accountants will certainly be able to give you some feedback on that decision and help you evaluate those pros and cons. If you're looking for a lawyer, you're looking for an accountant, you should definitely ask them how long have you been in business? How many of these businesses have you've set up? Are you familiar with this, that, or the other thing? Because some general practice law firms would be more than happy to file articles of incorporation for you, but upon interviewing them, you may learn that they're primarily a plaintiff's personal injury firm, and they really don't do a lot of business structure work. So I think it's just important that the lawyer is familiar with businesses, business structures, working with entrepreneurs. By the same token, you don't necessarily need a lawyer who specializes in securities law. Okay, that is such a sophisticated end of the spectrum that their knowledge is way beyond anything you're going to need. So, find that kind of happy medium.
That makes sense. Okay, and one last question here. Do you have to pay taxes on the business and then personally in an LLC? If you are currently a sole proprietor but want to limit your liability, is this a good option, or will the tax implications make it prohibitive?
I think that's a great question. So what's interesting about the LLC is that the personal income tax will be exactly the same as a sole proprietor, because the IRS and the state taxing authorities treat LLCs as disregarded entities. So any profit of the business flows directly through to the owner, and the owner simply states whatever income they've received and whatever taxes are due on their personal tax returns. So that really won't change. Now, there will be some additional paperwork with the accountant, because now that you've got a business and you're keeping track of profits and losses and that sort of thing, and what's allocated to the business, so on and so forth. So there will be some of that, but in terms of the taxes on the owner, there should be no change at all.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, thank you so much, David. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with our community. Definitely really positive feedback from the audience, and everybody's thanking you for being here with us. And if you guys do have any questions, we're happy to share the slide presentation with you and a link to the recording. But we hope that you can take this knowledge and David's expertise to make smart decisions with your business. At the end of the day, you are investing in your business, and sometimes it does seem like a lot of money. But when you think about what could happen, it's best to be protective. And I think that's kind of what we were getting at and what you were hitting at, David, at the end of your presentation with a couple of those slides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And if for those of you who don't know about Ivy yet or want to learn more, I'm going to run through and answer a couple of your questions. And thank you so much, David. We'll see you soon.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.